The Battle of the Hürtgen Forest remains one of the most disturbing chapters of World War II because it was a battle without momentum, without clarity, and without relief. It did not begin with a dramatic breakthrough or end with a clear triumph. Instead, it unfolded slowly, day after day, as American soldiers were sent into a forest that consumed time, strength, and lives with almost mechanical indifference. In September 1944, the Allied advance across France had created the impression that Germany was collapsing. Paris had been liberated, German units were retreating, and optimism filled Allied headquarters. Many believed the war in Europe was entering its final phase. The Hürtgen Forest lay directly along the path toward the Rhine and the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heart of Germany, and on maps it appeared to be a manageable obstacle. In reality, it was a natural fortress designed by terrain rather than engineers. The forest was dense and mountainous, cut by narrow valleys and poor roads that restricted movement and visibility. Modern warfare lost its advantages almost immediately. Artillery fire detonated in treetops instead of the ground, turning wooden splinters into lethal shrapnel. Tanks became liabilities rather than assets as mud, mines and terrain trapped them on narrow paths. Air support was unreliable due to constant fog, rain, and low cloud cover. The battlefield forced American troops into close-range combat where every step forward required blood. German forces understood this environment perfectly. Instead of defending with long continuous lines, they relied on scattered bunkers, machine gun nests, and minefields hidden throughout the forest. Even newly formed Volksgrenadier units could inflict severe losses when, fighting from prepared positions, American commanders believed pressure and persistence would break resistance. Instead, divisions were committed one after another into the same terrain, suffering heavy casualties for minimal gains. Medical evacuation was often impossible under fire, leaving wounded soldiers exposed for hours or days. Exposure, disease, and exhaustion became constant companions. As autumn turned to winter, conditions worsened further. Rain became snow, temperatures dropped, and supplies grew strained. Soldiers lacked adequate winter clothing despite the reputation of the U.S. Army as the best supplied force in history. The forest earned its name among the men who fought there, the Green Hell. This was not a battle of maneuver or speed. It was a slow erosion of strength and morale. And from the very beginning, it raised a question that still lingers today. Why did the United States continue to fight here at such cost? And what did the Hürtgen Forest take from an army that believed victory was already within reach? As the fighting in the Hürtgen Forest continued, the scale of the disaster became impossible to ignore. What had begun as a limited push soon turned into a grinding commitment that consumed division after division. American commanders rotated fresh units into the forest, believing that new troops could succeed where others had failed. Instead, the forest treated every formation the same. The 9th Infantry Division entered first and within weeks suffered thousands of casualties for almost no territorial gain. When the battered 28th Infantry Division was committed, the result was even worse. Entire regiments were shattered in attempts to seize small villages and ridgelines that held no strategic value on their own. Progress was measured in hundreds of meters while losses climbed into the tens of thousands. The German defense relied on patience rather than maneuver. Small concrete bunkers and foxholes were positioned to dominate trails and clearings. Minefields slowed advances and forced infantry into predictable paths. When American units paused, German counterattacks struck suddenly and vanished back into the forest. This constant pressure destroyed morale and denied any sense of progress. The terrain amplified every mistake. Radios failed under thick canopy. Units became disoriented and lost contact with neighbors. Friendly fire incidents increased as visibility dropped to a few meters. Artillery support was unreliable because shells detonated in trees instead of trenches. Even when ground was taken, it could rarely be held. Logistics collapsed under the conditions. Narrow roads clogged with mud prevented timely resupply. Artillery ammunition became scarce at a time when it was most needed. Food and medical supplies arrived late or not at all. Wounded soldiers often had to be carried for hours, through mud and under fire before reaching aid stations. In some cases, German medical officers allowed brief humanitarian pauses so American wounded could be evacuated. These moments of humanity stood in stark contrast to the brutality of the fighting. By November 1944, American forces had already paid an enormous price, and yet the objective remained unchanged. Advance through the forest, secure the dams, push toward the Rhine. Operation Queen was launched as a final attempt to break the stalemate. Massive firepower was brought to bear, but the results were limited. Portions of the northern forest were captured, including the town of Hürtgen, but the key dams and river crossings remained out of reach. The forest had absorbed months of effort and still refused to yield. What was becoming clear was that this was not a battle that could be won quickly or cheaply. It was a test of endurance that drained strength from an army that would soon face an even greater challenge. As winter approached, the battle entered its most hopeless phase. What had once been framed as a necessary push toward Germany now felt like a punishment with no clear purpose. Rain turned the forest floor into mud and then into ice. Snow covered the wounded who could not be evacuated. Temperatures dropped below freezing while many American soldiers still lacked proper winter clothing. Frostbite and trench foot spread almost as quickly as bullets. Men fought while soaked, exhausted and numb, both physically and mentally. The forest offered no shelter. Trees shattered by artillery collapsed without warning. Foxholes filled with water. Every night felt longer than the last. German commanders understood that they no longer needed to defeat the Americans outright. They only needed to delay them. The Ruhr River dams became a central concern. If destroyed or captured too early, they would allow the Germans to flood the valleys and halt any advance. If left untouched, they remained a threat, hanging over every operation. American units attempted to push toward these objectives, but each movement through the forest triggered ambushes and counterattacks. Progress stalled again and again. The fighting became repetitive and soul-crushing. Attack a ridge, take losses, hold briefly, withdraw or be pushed back, then repeat. Morale deteriorated rapidly. Veterans described the forest as a place where hope slowly died. Soldiers stopped asking when the battle would end and began asking only how long they could survive. Leadership struggled to maintain cohesion as replacements arrived with no understanding of the terrain or the danger. Many lasted only days before becoming casualties. The psychological toll was severe. Constant artillery fire shattered nerves. The absence of clear victories destroyed confidence. Men felt abandoned by strategy and betrayed by geography. Despite these conditions, the orders did not change. The forest had to be cleared. Each delay was seen as unacceptable, even as casualties mounted. By December, the situation worsened further, when German forces launched their Ardennes offensive. The Battle of the Bulge diverted attention and resources, but fighting in the Hürtgen Forest did not stop. It continued in parallel, draining strength from American units that were desperately needed elsewhere. Only in early 1945, after the dams were finally neutralized and floodwaters receded, did the forest begin to lose its strategic grip. By then the cost was undeniable. Tens of thousands of American soldiers were dead, wounded, or permanently broken. Large portions of the forest had changed hands multiple times. Without meaningful advantage, the battle ended not with triumph but with exhaustion. The Hürtgen Forest did not stop the Allied advance forever, but it delayed it long enough to leave deep scars. It exposed the limits of material superiority and revealed how quickly confidence could collapse when planning failed to match reality. As the fighting dragged on through late 1944, the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest began to reveal its deeper strategic consequences. What had started as an attempt to secure a flank and protect future advances toward the Rhine slowly turned into a grinding commitment that drained American strength at a critical moment. Divisions that entered the forest, expecting a limited operation, instead found themselves locked into weeks of continuous combat. Fresh units were fed into the same terrain and suffered the same fate. Commanders rotated formations not to maintain momentum but simply to prevent total collapse. This constant turnover meant that many soldiers entered combat without proper knowledge of the terrain or the enemy, repeating the same costly mistakes. At the same time, German defenders exploited their familiarity with the forest. They avoided large engagements and focused on ambushes, artillery strikes and counterattacks against isolated units. Every clearing and ridgeline became a potential killing zone. The Americans struggled to adapt their doctrine to these conditions. Artillery shells detonated in treetops, sending lethal splinters downward onto infantry. Radio communication was unreliable, and coordination between units often broke down completely. Medical evacuation remained one of the most severe problems. Wounded soldiers could lie for hours or even days before being reached. Stretchers had to be carried through mud, under fire, along narrow trails. Exposure and shock killed many who might have survived elsewhere. Morale suffered deeply. Soldiers spoke of the forest as an enemy in itself, something that watched and waited. Meanwhile, higher command continued to press forward, fearing that any pause would give the Germans time to recover. This pressure contributed to decisions that prioritized persistence over reassessment. By December, the cumulative effect was clear. American forces in the sector were exhausted and under strength just as the German Ardennes offensive began. The Battle of the Bulge did not occur in isolation. It struck units that had already been worn down in the Hürtgen Forest. In this sense, the battle had consequences far beyond its immediate geography. It weakened the Allied front at a moment of great danger. Even so, the fighting continued into early 1945, driven by inertia as much as necessity. The forest had become a trap of commitment. Once so much blood had been spent there, withdrawal seemed impossible. This logic ensured that the battle continued long after its original purpose had faded. By early 1945, the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest was approaching its end, but not because of a decisive breakthrough or a clear tactical success. It ended because the wider war moved past it. German control of the dams was finally broken, floodwaters receded, and Allied forces advanced along broader fronts that made the forest less relevant. What remained was a battlefield littered with exhausted units, shattered divisions, and questions that would linger long after the war. In hindsight, the battle became a symbol of how modern armies can be drawn into attritional fighting that serves diminishing strategic value. American commanders later debated whether the forest should have been bypassed entirely. Many concluded that the cost paid there far exceeded any benefit gained. Veterans remembered it not as a heroic campaign, but as an ordeal defined by fear, cold, and confusion. Unlike Normandy or the liberation of Paris, there was no moment of triumph. There were no cheering civilians or clear signs of victory. The forest simply fell silent as units moved on. Historically, the battle reshaped American military thinking. It highlighted the limits of firepower in restrictive terrain and the danger of underestimating defensive positions. It also exposed weaknesses in logistics, planning, and adaptability that would influence post-war doctrine. For the soldiers who fought there, the Hürtgen Forest was a reminder that war is not always about decisive moments or clear outcomes. Sometimes it is about endurance under conditions that strip combat down to its most brutal form. Today, the battle remains one of the least understood major engagements of the Western Front, overshadowed by larger offensives. Yet its lessons are profound. It shows how terrain, weather, and human limits can neutralize even the most powerful armies. It also stands as a quiet memorial to tens of thousands who fought and suffered in a place where Victory felt distant and survival itself became the measure of success.